Okay, thanks again. So we'll continue with our next session for today. We have two speakers, Amanda Holmes and Alexei Kukuljevic, but I'll introduce our first speaker, Amanda. Amanda Holmes is a doctoral candidate in the philosophy department at Villanova University. Her work is situated at the intersection of ontology and psychoanalysis, and she's planning to defend her dissertation, which is titled Erotology, Desire and Being in Lacan's Return to Freud, in spring 2020. She's currently based in Vienna, in Austria, and is teaching courses on philosophy and psychoanalytic theory at the Bratislava International School of Liberal Arts. And Amanda's paper is entitled Outrage, the Phallus and the Extimacy of Anger.
Okay, good. Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay with just this microphone? Okay, great. So, first of all, many thanks to Nadia and to the Extimacies Mellon group. It's really wonderful to have the opportunity to come here and present this paper. And I also wanted to give some thanks to Samo and to Mladen for the last comment from the last session, because I feel like it's the perfect introduction to what I'm about to present, which is a sort of reflection on the affect of anger. So with that, I will begin. It seems to me that our present moment, in times like these, if you will, one important line of inquiry is that into the nature of anger. Whether we're talking about the mobilization of anger in the rise of the populist right, or the liberal indignation that characterizes the Trump era in the US, or about the outrage that has sparked a series of uprisings across the globe in recent months, in Paris, in Hong Kong, and indeed here in Lebanon. The dominant political affect, if there is one to be named, is anger. There are no doubt many good reasons to be angry at our present historical conjuncture. There is undeniably a justified anger in the face of the many injustices of the present. There is perhaps even an obligation to stand in righteous indignation and explicitly political anger that is and has been the motor for political revolution and social change. This is the kind of anger that Aristotle called philanthropon in his Poetics. It is an anger that is born of love, of philia for humanity, for anthropon. It is where we get the word philanthropy from. But for Aristotle, the lover of humanity was not characterized by generous donations. The philanthropon was characterized instead by the, quote, righteous indignation that one feels towards undeserved good fortune, and the pity that one feels for anyone who suffers undeserved bad fortune. In short, according to Aristotle, a human being who aligns herself with justice, who has the virtue of the philanthropon, will be angry in the face of injustice and have a righteous indignation for illegitimate power. Aristotle's notion of anger as philanthropon can relate anger and righteous indignation to questions of justice and injustice, but things get a bit murkier when we pose the question to Aristotle, what exactly is anger? So in what follows here, I will develop a theory of anger primarily from Lacan's 7th through 10th seminars. It is a theory of anger that responds to this Aristotelian notion of anger as an adequate response to injustice. Lacan does not develop an explicit theory of anger per se, so what I offer here is a slightly speculative leap that elaborates upon a few remarks that Lacan makes on anger. What interests me about Lacan's comments on anger is that they illuminate two basic things. First, in relation to Lacanian theory, the comments on anger are always related to anxiety. We have this resonance in English. We can hear the Proto-Germanic cognate between anger and the German Angst, anxiety. Of course, for Lacan, this was not the case. The French colère does not expose its relation to anxiety, l'angoisse, as readily as it does for us working with the English translation. So I will develop some speculations about how we might translate anger in relation to anxiety, working in English somewhere between the German and the French. Second, Lacan's comments on anger offer a helpful articulation of anger as an affect that exposes a structure. What Lacan says about anger does not offer an account of the phenomenological experience of anger, but rather it provides a way of thinking about the structural relation at play within anger, of the way that it relates the subject to the other, situates the subject in language, indeed the way that anger relates the symbolic to the real. The utility of the account of anger that we can develop within the Lacanian framework is not due to the fact that it lays claim to the emotion of anger. It will not attempt to define what exactly it feels like to be angry or give a robust analysis of when anger is politically just or unjust. Instead, the psychoanalytic discourse opens up a space of interrogation where we can attend to the structures in which such a feeling is disclosed. So rather than appeal to the immediacy of anger as a feeling or affect or lived experience, psychoanalysis poses a question that is directed at the structure in which the affect of anger is articulated. What we get by turning to Lacan for a response to the question, what is anger, is an account of anger as a particular relation of the subject to the other, a relation mediated by the big other. So these are the elements at stake in my attempt here to elaborate a Lacanian theory of anger. But first, let me offer a quick caveat on affects. It is no secret that Lacan is suspicious of the discourse around affects. The appeal to affects as such always depends upon the distinction between affects on the one hand and intellect on the other. For Lacan, such an opposition is entirely unhelpful. As he puts it in the first year of his seminar, this opposition between affect and intellect is one of the most contrary to analytic experience and most unenlightening when it comes to understanding it. Or, as he puts it elsewhere quite decisively, our experience is not that of affective smoochy-woochy, or frotti-frotta if you want the French. So for Lacan, in short, the discourse on affect always leads us toward an impasse. Of course, it is not a matter of denying the importance of affects, but it is important not to confuse them with the substance of that which we are seeking, Lacan says, namely the unconscious. So the basic problem with the appeal to affects is that it does not deal with repression. Affects themselves are not repressed, as Lacan and Freud both insist. Signifiers are. For Lacan, affect is unfastened. It, quote, drifts about. It can be found displaced, maddened, inverted, or metabolized, but it isn't repressed. What are repressed are the signifiers that moor it. So because of this insistence on the signifier, Lacan has often been accused of not dealing adequately with affects. And then, in response to this charge, others have pointed out that this is not at all the case. Anxiety, after all, is nothing if not an affect, and Lacan dedicated at least an entire seminar to it. Lacan's relation to affect is something of a controversy, in part because he doesn't really deal with affects as such. Instead, Lacan takes up certain affects in particular: anxiety, hate, love, and I'll make the case here shortly, anger. But it is important and helpful to note that Lacan remains critical of the metaphysical notion with its question-begging appeal to the concrete that derisively goes by the name of affect. On Lacan's account, affects are not inherently meaningful, but are made meaningful according to their inscription within the symbolic. There is nothing natural about them, and their meaning is not intrinsic to the immediacy of experience, but it depends entirely on their articulation. As Lacan puts it, and I'll put it here, this is a long quotation, what people refer to as an affect is not something that is purely and simply opaque and closed off, not something that is somehow beyond discourse or a nucleus of lived experience that comes to us out of the blue. Affect is something that is always and very precisely connoted by a certain stance that the subject adopts with respect to being. I mean with respect to being, insofar as what is proposed to the subject is, in its fundamental dimension, symbolic. But it also happens that, on the contrary, affect constitutes, within the symbolic, an eruption of the real that is highly disturbing. End quote. So what we find in this passage is simply the idea that there is hidden in plain sight, in any experience, its structuration by the symbolic order of language. The fundamental claim is that any affect is structured as such by the symbolic. It is always an alienated experience mediated by the big other, articulated in language. Or rather, to put it more forcefully, the condition of possibility of being affected is being in language. The consequences of this claim are radical because it denaturalizes any pretense to the immediacy of affect. In short, the point is not just that it is in language that affects are named or expressed, but it is rather that it is in language that affects are at all. The radical nature of this point is perhaps best illustrated in what Lacan says about love, in reference to La Rochefoucauld, who put it so well. Love is a cultural fact. It is not only that how many are they who might never have loved but for hearing talk of love. It is that love would be out of the question were it not for culture. Even what feels like the most immediate affect here is put to be wholly mediated by language, by culture, historically determined, etc. Now, of course, there's much more to be said about love in particular, and it's much more complicated for Lacan, but I don't want to talk about love, I want to talk about anger. So we'll leave love aside for now. So I want to talk about anger because Lacan consistently returns to anger when he is discussing the discourse on affects. Almost every time he brings up the discourse on affects, so-called, he suggests that he's already said enough in what he has said about anger, and his definition is always the same. In the 10th seminar, for example, he says, anger is what happens in the subject when the little pegs won't fit into the little holes. What does that mean? When, at the level of the other, of the signifier, that is to say, always more or less at the level of faith, of bona fides, the game isn't being played. Well, that's what sparks off anger. So here we've come to our first Lacanian definition of anger. It is what happens when the little pegs won't fit into the little holes, when the game isn't being played. I take this to mean that anger has something to do with the dimension of expectation. It is when we assume that we know what is coming, that we have a sense of how to play the game. Things seem to be going well, and all of a sudden, someone else breaks the rules and foils our plan. They don't play by the rules. They intrude on an order that we had just perhaps gotten used to. This definition exposes that anger has something to do, then, with expectation. And earlier, in Lacan's 6th seminar, he gave the following complementary definition of anger. So this is another longer quote. Lacan says, "It is hard not to see that a fundamental affect like anger is nothing but the following: the real that intervenes at the moment at which we have woven a fine symbolic web, where everything is going well, order, law, our merit, and our pleasure. We realize suddenly that the square pegs do not fit into the round holes. That is the origin of anger as an affect. All is well on the bridge formed by the ships on the Bosphorus, but a tempest blows in that whips up the sea. All anger involves whipping up the waters. So there are a couple of things to emphasize about this other definition of anger that Lacan provides here. First, that anger is what happens when the real intervenes at the very moment when things seem to be going well, where everything is precisely in order. It does seem to be the case, in fact, that especially for those who keep things in order, whose enjoyment in life seems very tightly bound to the tidy arrangement of ideas and of things, for such a character, it seems that anger is quite often at the ready. But the crucial problem is that most orders, however firmly enforced, are as delicate as the order of the ships on the Bosphorus. They are formed only by a contingent and tenuous state of affairs, and can be split apart, rendered asunder by even slight disturbances. This image of anger as whipping up the waters supplements the other, that anger is when all of a sudden the square pegs do not fit into the round holes. In both cases, we have an image of a sudden intrusion, the moment when things no longer seem to fit or go together as they should. In the 7th seminar, Lacan elaborates a bit more on this image. He says there, and this is the third and last definition we get of anger. Anger is no doubt a passion which is manifested by means of an organic or physiological correlative, by a more or less hypertonic or even elated feeling, but that it requires perhaps something like the reaction of a subject to a disappointment, to the failure of an expected correlation between a symbolic order and the response of the real. In other words, again, when the little pegs don't fit into the little holes. So in this passage, we are given a more precise explanation of this metaphor of the square pegs in the round holes. Anger is about a failed expectation. There is an element of surprise. Something happens that wasn't anticipated and does not seem to fit into the schema with which we were at a certain point conceiving of the world and of our place in it, situating ourselves as subjects within the symbolic order. Among all the affects, anger seems to bear a relation to the situations that mark a rupture in one's expectations. In short, it seems that when the little pegs do not fit into the little holes, we have the structure of anger insofar as it is the affect that arises when something in reality poses an obstacle to desire's enterprises, the latter always being organized by the symbolic. It is when the structure that one uses to make sense of the world and one's place does not map onto something else confronted. Some aspect of reality that hadn't been accounted for throws a wrench in the whole order of things. This is certainly not a rational or even a predictable affair. One cannot predict the place of anger exactly, and its causality is not so clear. Anger can generate abrupt and disproportionate effects. Most often, these are negative and violent, leading often to self-destruction. But it also seems to be the case that anger can lead to a kind of subjectivation. We might turn to an example from the reflections of Barbara Cassin on the role of anger as a motivation in her own work. In a book with the somewhat unfortunate title, Women Who Make a Fuss, a kind of collection of essays that's based on letters between women in the French Academy, Cassin describes a formative experience from the beginning of her career. This is an excerpt from that reflection. She says, "It is always something in the order of anger that makes me draw together one action rather than another. It made me draw together writing rather than painting, philosophy rather than Greek, even though painting would have been easier than writing and Greek easier than philosophy. I did not choose the thing that was the most comfortable, natural, taking the slope I was inclined towards." So according to Cassin, it was a relation to her anger that motivated the choices that determined her work. She was shaped by this anger, but importantly, she was not consumed by it. Instead, the account that she gives now, and retroactively it should be noted, is that her anger made a kind of subjectivizing impact. She gives the following concrete example. Early on, she says, I wrote short texts, long poems and short stories that I printed and published myself. In 1973, perhaps, a book which spoke about a poem, it was a pseudo-poem that resembled one of Char's poems but wasn't his, and the notes were other poems, printed in different typographical styles. I showed them to some philosophers, and they said to me, "Ah, this is really very good. That's how you must write." But to say that's how you must write really means, damned little fool, don't do philosophy, it's not for you. Therefore, I could say, Les Fêtes Sophistiques, her first philosophy book, was a product of that anger. Ah, I'm not to do philosophy, you're going to see that I do it better than you. So this is the end of Cassan's account. What is strange and perhaps even a little funny about this story, what I like about it anyway, is that Cassan's anger was derived from nothing other than a compliment, at least technically. She's told, your poetry is excellent, to which her response is, fuck you, I'm going to do something else. As a matter of fact, I think I'll do what you do, but better. Something doesn't match up, at least at the order of the signifier, right? At least not at the order of expectation. Cassan's explanation reveals that the expectation in showing the philosophers her book of experimental poetry was not one of asking for their affirmation, or really even expecting it. So when she gets it, a form of it, regardless of whether it was genuine or condescending, it can only be received as the patronizing assignment to do what a woman should. Not philosophy, but poetry. If these philosophers had said instead, listen, Barbara, this experimental poetry thing you're doing is really a waste of time. Why don't you just study ancient Greek and write some serious monographs on Aristotle? Her response could have been to angrily defend the value of her poetry. It was the affirmation from the philosophers that irked her. Their praise was the cause of her anger. But it was not really about these empirical others, about the little others, the philosophers who gave her the praise. It was not so much to prove them wrong. Rather, the anger that she describes seems to have been generated primarily by finding herself placed in relation to the big other named as a poetess that really set things off. This anger led to a path in which Cassan puts herself in the place of those who made her angry. I'll do what you do, but better than you, she says. And in following through on this promise, she becomes them. That is, she becomes not only a philosopher. It's not just the simple point, though it's also an important one, as Lacan puts it in the 5th seminar, you are who you hate. But rather, the important point is that she becomes the one who determines what she will be. Her anger, in this case, subjectivizes. To the assignation, we know where you are, Cassan's anger responded, no, I am not there, and if you put me there, I'm going to look elsewhere. Cassan goes on to explain that this anger was never something that was mastered by her, nor was her response intentionally one of putting a positive spin on it. Rather, she needed the anger in order to shape her philosophical position. She writes, I need to get angry so that non-mastery may be a position. It is necessary to affirm it with sufficient force for non-mastery to be respectable. Making non-mastery respectable has enormous consequences. There's something like a panic in thinking differently, and then, faced with the panic, anger. But then, and this is the essential point, always, she says, I laugh. Happily, for Cassan in this account, a certain anger ultimately leads to a moment of laughter. It is a laughter that provides the recuperative moment in relation to her anger, that allows for her to tell the story of anger as something that was subjectivizing. But I'm somewhat less interested in the logic of the recuperating aspects of anger. I turn to this anecdote because it suggests that anger plays a central role in how it is that an identity coalesces around the misrecognitions that one receives from the other. That is to say, identities are formed not so much according to the insistence that one is what one says one is, but rather according to the insistence that one is not in the place assigned by the other. And somehow this place is a place of anger. Anger exposes a structure that insists not so much on the claim, I am this, but rather on I am not that. This is a relation to the other that is interrupted by a real, and it is the real that insists on a defining negativity. So if we return at this point to the definitions of anger given by Lacan, that it is when the little pegs do not fit into the little holes, when a certain order is disturbed and there is a whipping up of the waters. It is a moment where the real ruptures the symbolic order. What becomes clear is that the place of anger is precisely the point of the subject's encounter with the demand of the other, which is the formula for the drive. But what anger exposes is a kind of inversion. The demand of the other here is simply a demand for the articulation in language of a certain surplus. It is another way of forming the question, que vois, not as what do you want, but as what are you? Name your desire. And there are a couple of possibilities when confronted with this encounter. One possibility is anxiety, when the other's demand is too much, a kind of overwhelming that induces anxiety. But I wonder, and this is the sort of speculative leap that I want to propose in this paper, if perhaps anger is what happens when something in one, or rather something extimate, insists on responding to this question, que vois, I am not that. There's a subtle imbrication here between the concept of anger as an affect and the concept of aggressiveness as it gets formulated in Lacan's early thought. In his writing on aggressiveness in Psychoanalysis from 1948, Lacan theorizes aggressiveness as linked to the narcissistic relationship and to the structures of systemic misrecognition and objectification that characterize ego formation. One's identity is constructed over the course of a series of misrecognitions, of moments when one angrily says to the other, no, I am not that. But even in doing so, of course, misrecognizes himself in the declaration. But the point is that this aggressiveness underlies the process through which a subject builds an identity, learns to recognize herself in relation to others, and most importantly, at least in the mirror stage, finds in this altered image of the subject's body the paradigm for all of the forms of resemblance that will cast a shade of hostility onto the world of objects, by projecting onto them the avatar of this narcissistic image, which, from the jubilation derived from encountering the image in the mirror, becomes the outlet for his most intimate aggressiveness. So here we've slipped a bit from anger to aggressiveness. But in either case, the point that I want to make is that the formation of an identity on the basis of a negativity and an aggressiveness that psychoanalysis reveals is the place of the not, the formative place of I am not that. This not has a helpful resonance in English because there is an ambiguity between the not, as in the negative, I am not that, and the not with a K, the tying together of what makes me the not that I am. But this not is not simply tied to the negativity in one's angry defiance of the other, because this defiance also marks the place of the not with a K between the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The defiance that defines a subject in some way when it claims, I am not that, offers up only a fundamentally imaginary identification, instituting a relation that may be subjectivizing on the one hand, but on the other hand, if tied too tightly, this knot becomes one that binds. It runs the risk of imprisoning the subject in an ossified, rigid, imaginary construction, in the stubborn and angry insistence. And it is worth noting here that the root word ang, a Proto-Germanic word that is the root for both the English anger and the German angst, means tight or painfully constricted. So it is one thing that both anxiety and anger have in common. We've said before that anxiety is a case in which something is too much, but we might say also that anger is a case of something that is too tight, right? So this is kind of the related aspects. Okay, so it is in this, I'm coming to a conclusion here, so it is in the structure of identity as a knot that is made by the knot, the negative, that is the thing that psychoanalysis works on. As Lacan says, psychoanalysis alone recognizes the knot with a K. So psychoanalysis alone recognizes the knot of imaginary servitude that love must always untie anew or sever. In this sense, love is not at all an affect, but it is an activity, an action, a task. It is a task to somehow loosen the knot when it gets too tight, which means when it leads to anxiety or to anger. And the love that can perform such a task is transference love in this case. But Lacan goes on, this is a quote, "For such a task, we can find no promise in altruistic feeling, we who lay bare the aggressiveness that underlies the activities of the philanthropist, the idealist, the pedagogue, and even the reformer. In the subject-to-subject recourse we analysts preserve, psychoanalysis can accompany the patient to the ecstatic limit of the claim, thou art that." So we return here to our philanthropist, among a host of others, the idealist, the pedagogue, all men of goodwill in some sense. But let's focus for a moment on the philanthropist. We return to Aristotle's formulation of the philanthropon as one who loves humanity and whose love bears above all a righteous indignation and anger in the face of injustice. I do not aim here to simply critique the philanthropist and to argue for some kind of moral egoism, but I want to suggest that Lacan's thinking troubles something within the Aristotelian paradigm, and it is precisely the sense in which the virtue of the philanthropist stands in relation to the good, the way in which the anger and righteous indignation, even when borne by love, can be too constricting. The virtue of the philanthropon is not so straightforward. As Lacan says in his 7th seminar, such virtue is achieved through mesotes, something that is far from being a simple golden mean or a process linked to the avoidance of excess. Instead, it is supposed to enable man to choose that which might reasonably allow him to realize himself in his own good. Now, please note that one finds nothing similar in psychoanalysis. So the point here is that in relation to Aristotle, Lacan says, psychoanalysis is not that. Okay. So what psychoanalysis reveals is that there is a fundamental gap, a rupture, an absence, the place of the negative knot that ties the knot of identity. So Lacan insists upon holding open this space of the absence within the subject as a safeguard against the tendency to tie our knots too tightly. To conclude, I will return to one final time to the definitions of anger that we find in Lacan's seminar, that it is where the little pegs do not fit into the little holes, when there is a whipping up of the waters and a failure in the expected correlation between the symbolic and the real. With these definitions of anger, I think that we can see something more about the affective dimensions of extimacy as we have been discussing it throughout this conference so far. The not fitting together, the negative not fitting together, of the symbolic and the real can only be truly disturbing and bring about anger for the kind of extimate being that a speaking being is. That is, for the being who is intimately structured by what is external to it. The notion of extimacy is one that describes how the human being is held together, or rather tied together to carry this metaphor of the knot forward, by the structures of the symbolic. That is, its being in and of language is being in and of what is external to it. When the human being speaks, when it utters anything at all, it can only ever do so in the language of the other. One always speaks in the tongue of another. Even one's mother tongue is an other tongue, insofar as one's language is given by the other. So when the structure of language, the symbolic order, does not match up with something given in the real, in instances of anger, there is not only a disturbance outside of the subject, some external element that the subject must encounter and fight against. Anger is rather precisely a disturbance in the extimate relation between the symbolic and the real. That's all.
Next speaker is Alexei Kukuljevic. Alexei obtained his PhD in philosophy from Villanova University in 2009 with a thesis on Kant, Heidegger, and Deleuze. Since 2017, he's been an assistant professor of art theory at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. In 2017, he also published his first book entitled Liquidation World, on the art of living absently, published by MIT. And he's currently working on a second book entitled Like Hell It Is, on horror and hilarity, which will examine such figures as Richard Pryor, Harpo Marx, and Marguerite Duras. And Alexei's talk is entitled Extimacy and Stupidity, on being a dumb thing.
Well, I guess I'll do my best to be a dumb thing. Well, let me, again, to reiterate, what's that? Oh, yes. So just as that's circulating, anyways, thanks to Nadia and to the other organizers for the invitation. It's really, more wonderful than I even expected, in the good sense, bringing joy rather than anger in this sense, and to be here in Beirut. So what I have here to present, and I'm really going to try to keep to 45 minutes, but this required a kind of contraction or a constriction, a tightening of the paper. And in this case, it's not to announce that I was, that I'm angry about my allotted time, but that perhaps, that I tried a little bit too hard to jam, the square pegs into round holes. So if there's a little bit of, leaps that have to be made, you'll just have to bear with me. So the title of my paper sort of proposes to conjoin extimacy and stupidity. But I want to immediately sort of make a detour and propose that we approach this problem by means of a different conjunction, and this is a conjunction that you'll get on the handout, which is the relationship between art and absence. And so this is where I'm going to begin, with art and absence, this conjunction, which proposes to conjoin, of course, a familiar word, perhaps an overly familiar word, namely art, with a word that strikes the eye, at least, as odd. One does not hear the S in absence. One hears a C. But let me remind you that the C is here absent. One would not be amiss to think it a typo, but it is not. It may have been, but once it catches the eye with its hook, a certain sense accrues to this absence. So one ought to see the S in absence as not merely an S, but as a C with a hook. It is an S that is not sure of its place, of its identity. Is it merely posing as a C? It is not exactly an S, but more like the excrescence of the C. It marks something that is missing. It is, in this sense, in between sense, between what can be sensed, the aestheton, and the sense of sense. When something makes sense, when it adds up, to think in terms of dollars and cents, we do not question its meaning. We take it quite explicitly for granted. The sense of what is missing when the S is in the place of the C is in fact a missing sense. Absence, to exaggerate the failure, to make of it a caricature, here serves to name and thus amplify an absent sense. It presents to us an absence that cannot be made sense of. This is what art does. It makes sense absent. To cultivate a relation to this absence is what I have called, and Ray alluded to it, my book, The Art of Living Absently. So we arrive at the proposition that the sense of art is absent. And it gives us the hint, moreover, that this absence has something to do with a missing S. For when we speak of the arts in plural, we do not encounter a problem of art's lack of sense. This only begins when we speak of art as something that is singular and without any qualifiers. We speak, for example, of the history of art, not the history of the arts, debating perhaps its beginning and what ought or not to be included within this history. But the domain or field that is covered by art is not identical with the history of arts, which is synonymous with the history of techniques. To speak of a history of art presumes that it has an identity of its own, that it has a being that is discrete and differentiated from the arts. In short, to speak of an art in the singular is to presume its autonomy. Yet as soon as one attempts to identify or isolate the ground of this distinction between art and the arts, one is at a loss. One encounters this groundlessness, according to Heidegger, in the circularity of its definition. An artist is one who makes a work of art, but a work of art is something made by an artist. To speak of artists presupposes artworks, and to speak of artworks presupposes artists. Both the identity of the artist and that of the work of art presume a relation to art. And this is Heidegger. Art, this is nothing more than a word to which nothing actual any longer corresponds. And here he is, of course, in some sense repeating Hegel's claim in the opening of the Aesthetics. In all these respects, art, considered in its highest vocation, is and remains for us a thing of the past. So if art is not merely a work of art, if art is not merely a work of an art, that is, the work of an artisan, then the work of art in itself, to speak of pure art, as Flaubert would, is positioned in relation to its absence. It is utterly vacant. Let us say it's a true nullity. Art appears in itself only as the movement of its own abolition. If art is not a product, the work of artisanship, there is no criterion, measure, ground to differentiate it from what it is not. It can be made, it can be unmade, or not made at all. In short, it can be ready-made, as Duchamp illustrates, or as Flaubert famously puts it in a letter to his mistress, Collet, quote, "Masterworks are stupid, that they have the placid faces of the very products of nature, like big animals and mountains. A work of art is only when it is not what it is, namely something made." Now, what I want to do is just supplement this claim of Flaubert, that namely that masterworks are stupid, with two other passages. In other words, first, we should note, before then getting to these passages, that what Flaubert here is suggesting is that artworks are by no means intelligent, right, but idiotic, but this idiocy is in fact their virtue. So second, that what makes an artwork is its relation, as he puts it, to nature, not to how it was made. Right? So here we should think of, and we can think of, section 45 of Kant's Critique of Judgment, and this section's title is "Beautiful Art is an Art to the extent that it seems at the same time to be nature." So the work of art, as he puts it, is certainly intentional, but it, quote, "must nevertheless not seem intentional." That is, beautiful art must be regarded as nature, although, of course, one is aware of it as art. Now, for Kant, it has to, in other words, art has to accord with rules, but this accord, as he puts it, cannot be merely academic. The accord must be punctilious, but not painstaking. That's his criterion. So in other words, art cannot accord with what we expect from it. And this maybe is where it sort of joins up with Amanda's paper. Art cannot accord with what we expect from it. It must lack determination. And therefore, I'd like to pair this passage with another passage of Flaubert's, which sort of heightens this or let's say adds another layer to this notion that art has to be in the wrong place. In other words, it can't accord with what we expect from it. And so this is another letter to his mistress Collet. "I challenge any dramatist to have the audacity to put on stage of a popular theater a worker who is a thief. No, thank you. The worker has to be an honest fellow, and the gentleman is always a scoundrel. Just as at the Théâtre Français, the girls on stage are always pure because the mummies take their daughters there. I therefore believe in the truth of this axiom. People love falsehood all through the day, and dreams all through the night. Such is human nature." So maybe we return to the question of awakening that we dealt with yesterday. So here, false art, we could say, is precisely what conforms to an expectation. Expectations that he suggests are always moral. But the larger point is to also that I want to underline here, is that the very problem of art, of pure art, appears precisely when the criterion for art is no longer that of techne. Right? In other words, quite explicitly, Kant says in both and also Flaubert that it's this relation to nature. So the sense of art, insofar as it is indexed to the arts, right, now in the plural, remains tethered to the Greek sense of art, namely art as techne. It is a know-how, so this is techne, it is a know-how, a skill, that enables one to make or produce something. All works of art, in this sense, from tables and chairs to sculptures, or health, or stories, are not the creations of a particular artisan as much as the result of the conformity to the ends of a given art. So a particular doctor only produces health by conforming to the art of medicine, according to Aristotle. So this is obvious to us if for example, if we go to a doctor, Dr. So-and-so, and she cures me of an ailment, I don't think it is literally she who cured me, but her capacities or know-how. Now, in the art of poetry, right, but this is interesting because once we have the creation of the abstraction art, we obviously easily attribute, the creation of an artwork precisely not to a techne, but to the specific capacities of a given singular artist, right? So the art of poetry, according to Aristotle, poetike, produces a poem, a poema, through making an imitation or representation, mimesis, of a story, muthos. Now, the beauty of a story, according to Aristotle, thus depends on the organization of its plot, logos, and the propriety of its magnitude. It is thus the story and the kinds of people that the story is about, as Aristotle puts it, whether they are of high or low moral stature, that in turn determines the kind of story it is, its genre, and the kinds of affects and feelings appropriate to it. So, for example, pity and fear in the case of tragedy. Insofar as the work of art is thought in relation to techne, it is not the cause of itself, right? In other words, it is quite explicitly, we can say it is not autonomous, right, to use an anachronistic term. So what's interesting is that what we immediately see is that when art becomes a matter of its autonomy, there's a complete inversion of how autonomy would have been thought of in the Greek. I mean, in completely, so that autonomy for Kant is obviously on the side of freedom, and determinacy is actually on the side of nature. So we have a fascinating, a very clear, complete inversion of Aristotle here. So only nature, physis, is autonomous, which is to say, according to Aristotle, its source, arche, is internal to it. So in techne, rather, the cause is external to the thing that is made. And this is a quote by Aristotle. The source is in the one who makes it and not in the thing that is made. So as Aristotle clarifies, this entails that the sculpture, for example, lies in the skilled knower of the sculptor. That is, in the art of sculpting, and not what is only incidental to that art, namely the individual sculptor, polysitis, as he puts it. So this is quote, "It is incidental to the sculptor to be polysitis." So just as ethics for Aristotle is the art, let's say, of building character, poetics for him is the art of storytelling. To be excellent or virtuous in a given art requires conforming to a rule whose success can be measured in its capacity to produce the appropriate effect and affect, right, to conform to a given expectation. So and this is what's interesting, is one can, of course, then compete precisely in this art, right, in poetics, just as in poetry, just as one competes in sport. Because what is at issue is mastery over those it affects and those it aims to move. So mastery is ultimately the art of knowing one's place and knowing the other's place, of knowing how to shape and control the effects of one's speech and how to calibrate one's mode of address. It is a matter, above all, of knowing the limits of propriety. It is a matter of what Bataille, in his book on Manet, calls rhetoric. And so I have a passage here that I could read, but I'll just quickly summarize it. What he's interested in Manet is this moment in which Manet asks his models who are posing for paintings to divest themselves of any affectation. So that, in other words, the tendency of the model was always to strike a heroic pose, right? This is almost what the model already was expected. And Bataille claims, whether in fact we position it specifically with Manet or not is a matter of, is not important here. But what he's claiming, at least, is that the moment that he's interested in is Manet, is that Manet wants to strip, Manet strips art of its techne in the sense of the know-how that belongs to the expectation that it ought to have a certain rhetorical address. That, in other words, the model ought to appear in such and such a way. So art And art emerges as an effect then, in other words, art in the singular, not arts, emerges as an effect of a transformation in the structure of mastery, in which the products, and then this structure of mastery means one in which the products of art are subordinated to the calculated effects one expects them to produce. So we can say then art's loss of an S, right, appears like a symptom. It is an absence that marks an excess, something that exceeds the determinations of mastery, and thus whose effects are difficult, if not at times impossible, to predict or contain. The appearance of art, once it serves its function, once it has appeared, serves to split then the history of arts, in the sense of techne, in two. This split does not pass between, we could say, the liberal and the fine arts, but rather between the arts and art. Art names the ongoing, we could say, appropriation of this rupture or split, since art both is and is not an art, that is, a techne, but the separation of an art from a position of mastery. In other words, of a master that can decide on the difference between art and non-art. So not only everything that is made can be a work of art, but also that which is unmade or not made, Flaubert's boulder, right, or nature itself, in the case of an artist like Robert Smithson, or even then the refusal to make can itself, of course, become, in the case of Lee Lozano, for example, can be considered to be a work of art, or even the empty exhibition, etc. So art as such, and the history of art, we could say, is the ongoing effort to exhibit the effects of its absent sense. That's what I'm suggesting. So the conjunction of art and absence, now with an S, should make us think of the missing S in art and the missing C in absence. To hear art, one should sense what this lack of an S here signifies, that art is not one of the arts, right? And this means that it does not think in accordance with its form, right? Form in a very essentially equivocal sense as either immaterial, eidos, or shape, morphe. So to hear art, one should sense this lack of an S, so that art is not one of the arts. And this negation, this not, should make us hesitate over the sense of its singularity. A work of art that is not the mere result of the work of an art is neither simply a thing of use, could say, as Heidegger would say, a piece of equipment, nor is it merely a commodity, something that can be exchanged. But it is also not something merely natural, right? It does not have the character of having taken shape by itself like the granite boulder. Now, Heidegger resists identifying this thing, this interstice between the natural and the social, as a mere thing. To arrive at a mere thing through the process of subtraction determines the thing, this is Heidegger, its thing being as a mere leftover. And Heidegger adds, this remnant is not actually defined in its ontological character. It remains doubtful whether the thingly character comes to view at all in the process of stripping off everything equipmental. So to think the ontological character of the work of art is to think the being of this leftover. Now, that's obviously not what Heidegger's saying, but it's what I think is the case. So I'd like us to dwell on this moment, which Heidegger would like us not to dwell on, where we are faced, in other words, with a mere thing, a dumb thing, right? And here then art, as this absent sense, dumbfounds us. So art is a matter of dumbfounding. Now, in English, one can speak of being dumbfounded. One is dumbfounded when one is stupefied. One finds oneself in a situation or confronting a demand for which there is no response. As one of its first appearances in the English language attests to, in Thomas Urquhart's translation of Rabelais, to dumbfound is an embarrassment of the head. So I beseech you, this is a quotation, I beseech you never dumbfound or embarrass your head with these idle conceits. Or as another Thomas puts it, Thomas Otway, in a little red book, The Soldier's Fortune, quote, he has but one eye, and we are on his blind side. I'll dumbfound him. Then in brackets, he strikes him on the shoulder. So to be dumbfounded is to encounter something unexpected, unforeseen, and thus cannot be avoided, resolved, or circumnavigated. I cannot wriggle out of it. I am dumbfounded, as Charles Darwin put it. So in short, one finds oneself dumb, which is to say, unable to speak. What is dumbfounding founds the subject in dumbness, in silence. One is at a loss of words, trapped somewhere between being stunned and astonished, between stupidity and wonder. And if I get a chance to get to this, what I'm interested in moving to, and I don't know, maybe it's something that I'll have to postpone since it was extracted in this process of contraction, is that I'm interested then in precisely thinking through this relationship of what does it mean to be between stupidity and wonder. In other words, so that which returns us to the question of the relation between philosophy and art, where philosophy, in its origin is precisely considered to be precisely a form that where astonishment or a moment of stupidity can be converted into wonder, right? So that, and this would be the moment of overcoming an aporia. Whereas art, in other words, positions us, we could say, somehow askance, so that we, in other words, there's a kind of resistance to that conversion to wonder, where in fact we rather are on the side of stupidity. So I'm interested in this way in which the relation between art and philosophy can be sort of tendentially positioned along this line. Now, Lacan introduces the relation to the thing, which in the seventh seminar he defines as the beyond of the signified, as a matter of dumbness. Quote, the things in question are things insofar as they are dumb, and dumb things are not exactly the same as things that have no relationship to words. And interestingly enough, Lacan here introduces as a case in point the face of Harpo Marx. And I just want to read this lovely passage. Is there anything that poses a question which is more present, more pressing, more absorbing, more disruptive, more nauseating, more calculated to thrust everything that takes place before us into the abyss or void than the face of Harpo Marx? That face with its smile which leaves us unclear as to whether it signifies the most extreme perversity or complete simplicity. This dumb man alone is sufficient to sustain the atmosphere of doubt and of radical annihilation, which is the stuff of the Marx Brothers' extraordinary farce and the uninterrupted play of jokes that makes their activity so valuable. This is all that he really has to say about Harpo Marx. Now the question, and this is really going to be brief excursus around Harpo, but we could always come back to this. The question that Harpo's face poses is not that of a signified, of a possible meaning. His actions subtract themselves, we could say, from the sense we expect from a human being that speaks. And of course, he is defined by his dumbness, by not speaking. But as Lacan says, that's not exactly the same thing as being deprived of speech. So he is not without relation to the human being, but we could say he lacks humanity. He interrupts the circuit that allows us to attribute humanity to a human. So Harpo's face installs us in relation to the place of the signifier as such, the site from which we intimate the utter stupidity of the real. A site we intimate when a signifier no longer signifies something, right? And this is where it's interesting, where art then serves to perhaps introduce, to question at least a certain relation to philosophy, where philosophy is always speaking about something. Okay, we can talk a bit about that, but this is alluding to Plato's dialogue, the Sophist. So the question here does not pose, now the question here, Harpo's face does not here ask us to pose the question of the meaning of being, for it is not something about which we can speak. Right? The thing is present only in the relation of the signifier to its lack of signification. It is absently present. And Lacan here defines it, in other words, he defines the real as that which, defines it as that which in the real suffers from the signifier, which is this sort of formula that he returns to a few times in the seventh seminar, which I think is really a nice way to think through. What, in other words, the real is that which suffers from the signifier. So we can say Harpo stumps, he interrupts, and his actions are without cause, without rhyme or reason, but he himself is the cause, always the cause of the other, of the other coming up short, right? So he is a nuisance, he is an aggravation, and we could say he is a gadfly, right? Now the interesting is Harpo Marx a Socratic figure, right? So this will come, perhaps we can discuss that later. Now, what I'd like to do though is to try to in an effort to sort of return to this question of art as absent sense, to turn to Balzac's story, The Unknown Masterpiece, as a way, I think, which precisely marks, I think, in a very interesting way, this interruption of the movement from the arts to art, right? So what should be clear here, and this is why I think the analogy to Harpo's face is interesting, is that what Harpo also will interrupt is the capacity to attribute humanity to a human, right? So this, in other words, it interrupts this movement in which we want to generalize or attribute some generality, of sense to a particular instance of a given sense, right? It renders that impossible, and this is what I'm claiming art does too, so that we cannot simply think art as the generalization of the arts. So now Balzac publishes The Unknown Masterpiece in the periodical L'Artiste in 1831. And the central character of the short story, this painter Fraunhofer, is doubtless based on Delacroix. And so I've skipped over a little section where I'm commenting on Baudelaire's introduction of or essays on Delacroix, and in particular, he has these interesting formulations about the way in which the initial response to Delacroix was one of stupefaction. So he actually says astonishment and stupefaction. So Baudelaire inscribes, in some sense, the terms that I'm wanting to think through here. Now this short story by Balzac is set in the 17th century, and the central figure, the painter Fraunhofer, provides, quote, a consummate image of the artist's nature, as an incarnation of romantic genius. So everything about this old man, this is a quote, transcended the limits of human nature. So we should immediately note then the anachronistic nature, so that we have the quintessentially romantic artist nonetheless being set at the heart of the classical era. So Fraunhofer is depicted quite precisely as an artist and not a mere painter. A mere painter, according to Fraunhofer himself, remains, quote, satisfied with the mere appearance of things. An artist such as Raphael, on the contrary, is never deceived by all those subterfuges. He perseveres until nature is forced to show herself stark naked in her true spirit. It's a quotation. So the artist is one who not only paints, this is Fraunhofer, many painters succeed instinctively without ever knowing this theme of art, but philosophizes. In other words, Fraunhofer, like Raphael, according to Fraunhofer, is animated by a passion for truth, a truth that is touched upon only through the inscription of a difference, that is, nothing at all. So here it is through the inscription of rien, a nothing. So what I'm interested in now is precisely this singularization of nothing, rien, a nothing. And this is a quote, what's lacking, a trifle. So this is how Richard Howard translates rien. So a trifle, but we could say, what's lacking, a nothing. That's nothing at all, yet a nothing that's everything. So the citation. For Fraunhofer, it is this nothing that carries the burden of differentiating the appearance of life from the expression of its overflowing abundance, that je ne sais quoi, which might even be the soul floating like a cloud over the envelope of flesh. Yet, for those of us who have read this story, we know it does not end well for Fraunhofer. His attempt to render the living presence of his troublesome beauty, La Belle Noyeuse, Catherine Lescaut, results only in her utter dismemberment. All that remains of her is a mere stroke of the brush, the, quote, tip of a bare foot. So when these other painters come to inspect this perfect work of art, in other words, when Porbus and Poussin confront the painting, they are not speechless with admiration, but stupefied, and interestingly fear that they are in fact the objects of a cruel joke. Quote, the old fraud's pulling our leg, Poussin murmured, returning to face the so-called painting. And here, so-called painting is prétendu tableau. All I see are colors daubed one on top of the other and contained by a mass of strange lines forming a wall of paint. Now, again, the translator Richard Howard renders prétendu on this occasion as so-called. Elsewhere, he translated as imaginary, which suggests that it is, but translating it as so-called, prétendu, suggests that it is not a painting, but a painting in name alone. So it is a painting whose status as a painting has been suspended through an onslaught of paint, right? Through an onslaught of brushstrokes. So the painting is all but destroyed, yet prompted by the sense that something must be missing, Porbus then discovers in the corner of the canvas this mere fragment, right? The tip of a bare foot emerging, this is a citation, from the chaos of colors, shapes, and vague shadings. A kind of incoherent mist, but a delightful foot, a living foot. The existence of this moment serves to arrest their gaze. So, quote, they stood stock still with admiration before this fragment, which had escaped from an incredible, slow, and advancing destruction. We can say, though, they are more literally frozen stiff, petrified. So I think the French there is pétrifié, by what they see, this bit of nothing, right? Un rien, what Baudelaire might call an embellishment of the void. So if the painting is no longer a painting, but prétendu, this fragment positions it in relation to art. Right? So it is no longer a painting, but a so-called painting because destroyed. But it is nonetheless art. So Fraunhofer's masterpiece is unknown because it is unknowably situated between being nothing at all, right, a mere canvas, and being art. It is either, we could say, it is either a work of art or nothing at all, in virtue of the suspense of its status as a painting. So, what establishes this difference is the literalization of the je ne sais quoi in the fragment of the tip of the bare foot, right? So the young Poussin, confronted with such a decision, in other words, that I'm posing between it being either a painting either a work of art or nothing at all, consigns it to oblivion. So he says, but sooner or later, Fraunhofer will notice that there's nothing on his canvas. And it is this judgment that then serves to undo Fraunhofer's delusional belief in his own genius, right? Shaking him from his naivete. So he thought that he had made a perfect work of art, but then this is utterly shattered by this judgment. And overcome with crippling anxiety, this is the term, he contemplates his painting, then staggers as if from a blow, declaring, "Nothing, nothing," and after working 10 years, he sat down and wept. "I'm an imbecile then, a madman, with neither talent nor ability, just a rich man who makes no more than what he buys. I've created nothing." Now the story lays bare what is at stake in the difference between an art, a painting, and what appears when a painting is no longer a painting. So what I'm particularly interested in these moments when the identity of thing is established precisely as a non-identity. So a painting is precisely a painting that is not a painting. But one has to say that it is a painting at the same time that one says that it is not a painting. So what appears is not simply nothing, we could say nothingness, but nothing. The void's embellishment, again to rely on Baudelaire's term. The void punctuates. In this case, it is singular, and it is this punctuality which neither Poussin or Fraunhofer can think, right? But nonetheless, that the story, that this work of art, this work of literature solicits us, we could say forces us or proposes us to think. It presents to us an object of absence, a thing in the substituted place of painting, the thing that we all too easily simply call art, right? So what is named here is precisely not a sense, but that which appears only in relation to its destruction, the destruction of the sense of a painting. We should take Fraunhofer's claim to have created nothing quite seriously by shifting stress from what he does to what appears in the contingency of its place. If we focus on what he does, then we are condemned to viewing what appears. If we focus on what he does, then we are condemned to viewing what here appears, namely its result, the tip of a bare foot and a ruined painting, as a bit of bad fortune, symptomatic of an irreparable gap between, on the one hand, his attention or desire to make a perfect painting, and the demand that it assume legible form. Right? A living work of art, in its very accomplishment, then in this reading presents to us death itself. Right? So, and this is actually how Giorgio Agamben, for example, will read the story. And I'm wanting to inflect the story differently, right? So that, in other words, it's not only about a story that allegorizes the impossibility of incarnating the ideal, right? In other words, that's not what I think is at stake here. And this failure, then, is a fault that Fraunhofer himself cannot live with, and that he actually, interestingly, wants to destroy forever. So the end of the story, he burns his work, and then he dies. So from the perspective of mastery, this remainder, this bit of nothing, is itself unbearable and must disappear. Why? Precisely because it signifies its failure. So one thinks here, and one might think here in reference to some of what was discussed yesterday, of the Marquis de Sade's Last Testament, right? In other words, his desire to be buried without a trace, right? However, one need not follow the judgment of Poussin. Poussin's judgment of a failure, there is nothing on the canvas, is in fact a failed judgment. He fails to see what is in fact given, which is only given through the very form of its failure. Art appears only in and through its failure to be whole. Art is not whole, here with a W, which is to say it makes a whole, without a W, in sense. Yet this whole, we can say to adopt this formula from the seminar on anxiety, this whole without a W, is not without sense if we refuse the demand to make sense of it. That which is not without sense is what I presented at the beginning as absence. So now let me just conclude here, and I'm surprising myself. I'm still within my 45 minutes of allotted time here, which I really didn't think I would manage it. So let me now conclude then. So if we are to take this conjunction seriously, art and absence, then we have to abandon the expectation that art makes sense, that its being has a meaning, that its substance is anything other than liquidated. We must take this vacuity seriously. So let me propose a definition. Art is the abscess of absent sense. The S adds something to the C in absence. It is an abscess of the letter. We can say a contusion of the letter, a placing of its true nonsense, as if the added stress on the C had produced some swelling, or as a punch to the gut might produce dropsy, if I might just produce a pun. So we can see it's a kind of senseless cedilla, or the letter's bone spur. So what I'm really trying to do here is emphasize that in other words, the C doesn't just simply become another recognizable letter, right? And it's precisely in the figuration of it that this happens, that it's separated from its signification. So something forced to the surface, we can say this is why it's an abscess, it's something forced to the surface through a displacement. So I would like we can perhaps here think, as Nadia suggested at the beginning here in reference to Lacan, of a vacuole, but we might also think, again, almost perhaps to be a little bit more obscene, and to hear the Greek resonance of edema, right, of edema, from oiden, which is to swell, defined as a condition characterized by an excess of watery fluid collecting in the cavities or tissues of the body, right? So there's this swelling of the letter. Now, art appears then as a displacement of meaning, of sense, a void that somehow literally fills an absence. A hollow is, we could say, is formed and filled. A vacuole is made. And what appears as art in and through this nomination is an absent sense. Art is thus not something that merely resists definition, that is difficult to define. Its lack of definition, we can say, is definitive. It is positively lacking. Okay, so I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for both papers. I will have not really a question, kind of more following on what Amanda has developed. I really liked every little piece of how you collect, or how you composed this question of anger together with anxiety, together with desire, I would so say, and as the very core of identity. The noting and negation, and of course there is this question whether there is, because obviously in this I am not that, and then in the metonymy of desire that follows from there, because you could also say I'm not that, and every time something is imposed on you, you can refuse it and move elsewhere. So there is this metonymy of desire, and then the not that nevertheless ties you to a certain identity, which for me kind of rhymes a lot with a kind of a fundamental hysterical position. So first, one question would be, is it like, do you place the very hysterical no here at the very core of any identity formation, or is it just like but actually what I wanted to say is more, it's not, it's more kind of train of thoughts that I had in listening to you, and that go in a slightly additional direction, namely taking up again this question of relationship between anger and resentment, whether they are similar or not. And I will just try to, because I've written a lot, I try to make some sense of these associations. When you started out by pointing how there is this kind of deception, that there are expectations that are kind of deceived there, that you expect something and it is not there, and that there are rules which are being kind of broken, they are no longer there. So I was wondering whether, I would say there is something in resentment which to my intuition works precisely at that point. So what is these expectations? There are rules at play. So we can say as like social subjects, we were, like, put it in this kind of like mythological, obviously, phantasmatic way, but as a social subject we are always we are always asked to give up something in order to be part of the social contract. So there is this kind of renunciation, and of course, in the Lacanian perspective, a certain guilt that comes not from transgressing the law, but precisely by sacrificing something in order to subscribe to the law, that is there. And I have the impression that very often resentment, both in individual situations as well as in the social context, is a kind of effect of this, let's say, guilt of this, I did something, I gave something up, but you betrayed your part of the bargain, your part of the contract. So I'm well, I mean, even if I'm just a poor worker there, I'm aware, I mean, I accept this contract, but then when you even fire me from that position, or even enable, then there's something happens that is resentment, in which is, I think, very much reinforced by the very guilt. It's not that, okay, so you are guilty anyway, because why did you give up on something? This is precisely that is kind of wrong and illogical behavior. It is really, it's a kind of forced choice, of course, guilt, but guilt nevertheless as a certain effect that is no longer covered or bound by the social contract, which doesn't work in the way you expect it, considering what you kind of think you accepted at the beginning. So, and there is this kind of, so I was just wondering whether there was a kind of nexus on the one hand between desire and anxiety and anger, in this sense as identity forming, and this kind of a renunciation, drive, resentment that is also very much part of the, what is, or are they more, something, it's just kind of a couple of things.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. I mean, I think that's precisely the sort of constellation of things that we're trying to work through, I suppose. And I think, and so to begin with the first point about the sort of hysterical structure, and the sort of no being potentially kind of always the hysterics know, but then metonymically sort of says no, and then, but nevertheless forms this not. That, I mean, I suppose, I think there's different ways of assuming the not, that's created by the not. And that Lacan gives us this structure for understanding different ways that it can be tied us. And for the hysteric, the point would be in some ways the point of analysis for the hysteric is not just to loosen the knot, but to completely sever it in order to tie it anew. I don't know. I mean, it's like I wouldn't want to suggest that there's any other positions like the hysteric, unlike the pervert, or unlike like that there would be just different kinds of that there's any place from which this negative aspect is not defining. But I do think that maybe it's because of this example that I used. It sort of it does seem to abide by a certain hysteric structure. I mean, I'll have to think a little bit more about whether or not the claim would be that there's something hysterical in like the formation of identity as such. Yeah, so this is sort of the way that I am thinking of it at the moment. But it does seem like there are potentials to like to kind of at least have a hysteria light or something. like maybe, I don't know, maybe there's resources here for thinking what it means to have a relationship to that anger where it doesn't sort of consume you. And then the consuming anger would be on the side of resentment. It would bring us to this sort of place where, you know, this knot that I've issued at one point, this like negative relation to the other, it gets so tightly sort of bound that then I have no freedom with respect to it. And I think that there's something like degrees, or, I mean, I don't have like a good, it's a problem for me still. I mean, I think it's, but I think that there's this kind of constellation of metaphors that I'm trying to use to really understand like what's at stake in the formation of subjectivity, and in particular for thinking political subjectivities that cannot be like so determined by resentment. I mean, I guess part of the point in trying to articulate this would be to identify and conceive of possibilities of like loosening. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks for both papers. I guess I have maybe two comments and maybe to kind of follow through with this question on, I mean, it would be interesting to think about, you know, probably all the analysts in the room can confirm this, is that, you know, the kind of hystericization that happens somehow in analysis, which is crucial, of course, to the analytic process. It's regarding, I suppose, whatever, okay, besides, it's very hard with psychotic, I suppose, but like, I mean, it is a crucial component. But then there's this interesting thing about, and I think, I don't know, I might have talked about this with you before, but there's this interesting thing about like, in the so-called kind of end of analysis, there's also kind of a fury with the analyst. You know, there's this kind of, you know, this kind of anger with the analyst, like, you know, but then the analyst somehow, it's becoming the object of the fury. And then supposedly this may be an interesting, how does the analyst kind of somehow come into this position of being the dejected object, like but there is a sense of the affect is that there is an anger, like, at the analyst. And I think, I don't know, this is something interesting to kind of consider. And then I just had a kind of another comment for Alexei. Do I just say them? I mean, it was all a lot to think about. But I was thinking of kind of the late Lacan, like the really late stuff, the crazy stuff on Joyce. I mean, the kind of the way that he describes Joyce as the artist, as kind of like, to use the word, I think, you know, trashitas, I think, or like, you know, literally as a piece of shit, right? No, I mean, he has this description of art as almost kind of like the sewage of civilization, and I don't know, the swelling and the sewage, you know, your edema, I don't know, it just kind of like somehow, this is kind of somehow just what came to mind.
Just to say that, I do think that's part of the idea in some ways is to identify anger as, you know, a potential site in ways that we thought about anxiety, but also, like, as you're kind of bringing up, there is something that can also be quite subjectivizing, as in also the Cassandra story, that there's a moment of a certain kind of necessary sort of relation for kind of freedom, and so, but that it also has these other kind of pitfalls within the very same structure that can allow for like difficult entanglements, I suppose.
I can't necessarily speak directly to the seminar on Joyce, just because I haven't read it, so I have to confess that. But I do think, nonetheless, that I can say something that I see, the question prompting, which would be, and I imagine, that this is somewhere what Lacan's interested in, precisely because of Joyce as being, in some sense, let's say the master of the pun, and which is also interesting to even, let's say, even how I just formulated that, the master of a pun, precisely because the pun is precisely that nodal point that undoes mastery. So you have an interesting sort of, let's say, problem, right? Which would be, and this is often maybe one way of thinking about it would be the difference between Beckett and Joyce. That Beckett, and even the very early, one of Beckett's earliest, engagements with Joyce very early on is this short story Dante and the Lobster, where it's precisely an attempt to mobilize, we could say, a form of humor that would be, I think, a different form of humor than that of let's say, of the pun, per se. In other words, it sort of situates itself between wit and humor and comedy. This is what's, I think, very interesting about Beckett. So, in other words, in Freud's joke book, he's kind of very careful to distinguish, or he really wants to identify and make distinctions between, wits and then comedy. And in Lacanian terms, right, wits actually would be symbolic, and comedy, the way that Freud characterized it, would actually be on the imaginary level, because it's dyadic, as Freud lays it out. And whereas it's only at the level of the wits that you actually have the introduction of a third. So it's actually only at that point that the unconscious is mobilized, where he sees it, whether that picture is accurate or not. I think what's interesting is that you actually have in Beckett, and there's that famous passage in Watt where he mobilizes different forms of laughter. And then he says that the highest form of laughter, the laugh of laughs, as he puts it, is dianoetic laughter. So it's a laughter that laughs at what is unhappy. That's how he puts it. But what's interesting is what dianoetic laughter would be precisely laughter that is addressed to the moment of thought. What I'm trying to do here, the moment of thought in art, which is the moment in which it's autonomous, which means that it's precisely autonomous in the sense that it overturns this Aristotelian distinction, which places thought external to the art object. The art object internalizes it only through the production of this fragment of the letter, right, which is nonsensical but differentiates it from mere nonsense, right? So it's not without sense, but it's this differentiated punctual nothing that sustains the art object in this suspended space of its own non-meaning, so to speak. And I imagine that Lacan would be interested in doing some, at least, I don't know if that's exactly what he does in that, but I could imagine that there would be a lot of resources there, and I should read it.
Is that loud?
Thanks to both of you. I have a question for Amanda. Thanks a lot. I thought it was a very useful way of thinking about anger, especially the fact that even the beginning of your talk linked it quickly to the current uprisings that we're seeing on a global scale, and that's what I kind of just wanted to hear if you could elaborate a bit on, because I felt the way that you then went through anger was more explaining this way that it can become this kind of obsession with the question of identity, which if you would translate that to like some kind of political level would be maybe the neoliberal version of identity politics today that has been the crisis of the left for a while. So if you could elaborate on how anger then could be understood in the way that we are seeing it at the moment being expressed. Is it like finally an alternative to that kind of obsession?
Yeah. I mean, I would like to maybe elaborate more in the longer version of this about this idea of really the eruption of the real in these terms. I mean, because it's true that a lot of the ways that I'm talking about it here is about the ways that personal kind of narratives or anger, might form in ways that kind of coalesce an identity, as I was putting it. But with identity politics, we could say, in some ways, these are precisely the cases where the knot is way too tightly bound, right? Like, in order to develop a politics not of identity, but of solidarity, one would have to think through forms of subjectivity that allow for this constitution of kind of gap, kind of absence, kind of lack. And I think that Lacan gives us something that's, it's not like a programmatic politics, but I think it's a picture of subjectivity that could be really useful for thinking about, an alternative to what it means to mobilize. In terms of like these collective moments of anger and sort of, outrage, I guess this is where the notion of extimacy, I also, I thought to treat this notion of outrage precisely because we have even in the word that outrage is precisely when one is outside of oneself. There's something that's somehow extimate, ecstatic, and that these moments are incredibly powerful, but they don't necessarily provide the position from which then, we move forward. I mean, they're necessary. It's not like it's not a critique of anger or anything like that. It's just trying to attend to and think through what is the structure that's at play, precisely in these moments of outrage. So, yeah.
No, just thank you.
We have to I mean, yeah, come on, we have time. We'll eat quicker.
Read quicker.
It's okay. We can have, was there another? You have.
No, Surti.
I can just make it quick, and it's more just a reflection. I think your papers work really well together, actually. There's a lot of things going on that are similar in some ways, but it made me think about this kind of, in both your papers, this kind of movement of negativity from, sort of the perfect painting or a fully formed identity, and an identity that is sort of, it's a perfect identity, or it's a good identity, or the perfect work of art. And this kind of this movement against it. So the not I, or the work of art that begins to undo itself. It made me think about there's the documentary Gerhard Richter painting, and there's sort of these moments where these big scale works of art are created, and they go through this process, right, where he paints them. And they actually reach this pitch of beauty at a certain point, this kind of harmony. And at a certain point, even all the sort of the staff that he has that helps him paint these works of art recognize this moment, right, of beauty, because they know what's coming is that eventually he's going to destroy that beauty, right, and it will turn into a different work of art. He will, render it ugly in a sense, aesthetically ugly. But he allows that beauty to exist for some time. So there's a kind of temporality to that undoing as well. And it exists for a limited amount of time, for a very limited audience. I mean, just the people that are working, or just for him. So it just sort of has this moment before its eventual demise, as though it can't exist because of the conditions of modern art, because of the conditions of modern society, and so forth. That if that beauty was to remain, it would be an inauthentic beauty, right? And this sort of links up to the earlier paper as well in terms of authenticity and illusion. And that seemed to me to be the case in both these papers, right? That there's something kind of inauthentic about the achievement of that identity that must be undone. And I thought there would be a kind of really interesting political, social reading there, right? Why this beauty or why this identity must be undone? Why there's this negation, this no? And so the fragment is also, the abject and the extimate and the ugly, right? And why these kind of notions also historically appear both in the history of art, but also, from certain perspectives in modern subjectivity as well. So I just think there's an interesting link, and I think these things can really be followed through. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything to add to that, so that was great. Thank you.
Well, I could add something. I think in particular, I guess the one thing that I'm interested in terms of posing the question of negativity, is precisely to differentiate, the punctual negativity from nothingness, so that we have to be able to differentiate, let's say the formal structure of negativity itself. And I think that's where, why I think particularly that art becomes of interest, because it can do that. And one way in which it would do that would be, of course, the legacy of the question of beauty becomes, like as you were saying, very, very, significant. But I think, I wouldn't necessarily want to say that we have to disavow the concept of beauty. In particular there, I think the figure to turn to would be Baudelaire, where then, the famous poem that was first excised from Cloud of Evil is the corpse. So the corpse then, precisely the most abject moment, becomes a site where the poet actually has to begin to think, the hymn to beauty. So what does that mean then, and when beauty is precisely that which is utterly dismembered and decomposing, right? Or as he puts it in the happy corpse, that we have to actually become, something like a corpse picked clean by the crows. So that would be where I'd be, so this moment of dismemberment of beauty, producing a form of beauty that would be, non-classical, in the sense that it wouldn't be predicated upon harmony or wholeness or things like that.
Can I have one last comment?
Sure.
Okay, thank you so much. I just have a question, maybe let's say it's a question to Amanda. First of all, thanks a lot. I really thought your presentation was very thought-provoking. I'm building on what Karen said and also what you answered, and a more political kind of question. If we take what you say as given that the anger, when the knot becomes too tight in a way, you can fall prey to these, let's say, identity politics for now. In a sense of like a very fixated identity through this anger. And one method that you provided, or let's say Lacanian, but to use that negativity and lack as a way to kind of unknot, right? And then therefore maybe extend the kind of solidarity through that negativity. I'm thinking of the opposite scenario, and I want to see if that's plausible to you. I'm thinking of the works of someone like Asad Haidar in his recent book, Mistaken Identity, where he posits that it's okay to start with an identity as a source of understanding oppression and injustice. But the problem with him is that it's not being linked to class politics. It's not being linked to a true class, which then extends solidarity. And therefore, you get stuck in that identity, right? And so that, my question is, should we think of diffusing that knot or untying the knot in a sense of negativity and then therefore openness in that sense? Or should we rather almost universalize it? Almost extend that anger into a class, you know what I mean? Like a class politics, universalize it to realize that it's not only you, your anger is not individuated, but is a collective feeling, and therefore to link your specific anger in a way to the broader class politics.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. So the answer to the question, it helps me to articulate something that I think is very important, because I don't want us to get too lost in this knot metaphor. I can kind of get fascinated with it. But the point of Lacan, the reason that it's important right now, is that, or the point of thinking this, or not the point of Lacan as such, but the reason that I think it is important is that it's precisely because it's a discourse about this affect, which is so motivating, which is so moving, but points us to a structure. I don't get caught up in the anger of the thing, of the identity of the thing. What happens is, through Lacan, I can actually think about how that relates this feeling, this thing, to the others with whom I can be in solidarity. So it's not just some openness and ethical, it's really about how is it that I see myself as part of the structure. So then this is where we have kind of Marx and Lacan in a way, really in dialogue with each other. So that would just be the really basic, the basic kind of move that I would want to make. And so yeah, so I think it actually would not necessarily be like an alternative, you know, in some ways it's precisely like the loosening that allows then for a relationship to structure such that the affect itself does it. There's no like claim to the immediacy, it's a recognition that that affect is always already structured. Yeah.
Okay, thanks again. Thanks for some great papers.